Hi, everybody. I'm Mara Yale. I'm hosting these webinars, and I'm going to introduce the series and then our speakers for today. So today's topic is enhancing life participation with applied neurorehabilitation technologies after pediatric stroke. And we're grateful to have Payton and Adam here to share their expertise with us from the University of Calgary. As you know, stroke in childhood or even infancy or in utero affects the whole lifespan. And while we often start with a diagnosis in a medical setting, it can affect life throughout all the realms where you spend time. So, as a disclaimer, we are offering educational content here. If you have specific questions for the speakers, we ask you to frame them as generally as possible. And if you have medical questions, of course, seek guidance from your own care team. Thanks. So, what's this education series? Oh, I notice I need to update the year to 2025 here. We've been at this for 6 years, building community through education, specifically for families affected by pediatric stroke or brain injury. We've delivered more than 50 sessions. Most of them are on our YouTube channel, and I'll post links in the chat. And if you want to register for future events, you can go to this site, ygsa.org, PD stroke, or the QR code. And again, I will post links in the chat. We're collaborating like today with many other institutions. So this is coming from really worldwide experts in these topics. And just so you can see the current plans for this year, we're in this one that's highlighted in bold. The next two are thematically about driving, but one is about learning to drive and actually considerations about whether it's safe for somebody who's had a stroke or brain injury to drive, what the driving certified driving instructors can do to evaluate safety and what kinds of accommodations might be needed. So that's on Valentine's Day. And then in March, we'll be learning about toy cars and how they can help with mobility and hand use. And then our fourth annual in-person event called Play to Thrive will be May 10th in Boston on the waterfront outside of Spalding Rehab Hospital. So we hope to see you there if you're local. And I'm going to stop my share now and turn it over to Payton.
Hello, my name is Payton Shaw, and I am here today to share a little bit about my lived experience with a stroke and how it affected my life, both in the past and currently. So, I would like to start off with a quick introduction of myself. So, I am currently enrolled at the University of Calgary in the engineering program, where I hope to pursue a degree in biomedical engineering with a specific focus in rehabilitation engineering. The work I've been able to do with the BCI for Kids program has been amazing, and I have been able to work in my field of interest and use my stroke history to share my experience with many incredible people. My parents began to observe unusual symptoms that emerged in my grade 2 year, primarily, but not limited to, the loss of function in my left leg. However, it wasn't until testing undertaken for a genetic disorder that we became aware that a stroke had occurred. From that point on, I underwent a series of testing that eventually led to a procedure to confirm that the vessel that hemorrhaged had indeed been destroyed. After this diagnosis had been confirmed, I began my rehabilitation to try to regain function in my leg. This included regular physiotherapy involving different stretches and exercises, as well as regular visits to the Alberta Children's Hospital in Calgary. Due to the exceptional care that I have received, I currently do not experience any limitations because of my stroke. And due to this, I've involved myself in different programs within the stroke community to try and share my experience. It started when I got involved with the Lifts for Kids, which stands for Leveraging Inclusion and Friendship to Thrive After Stroke program, which looks to build community amongst children who have experienced a stroke, and I work as a peer mentor. And I began this in 2023. Through Lifts, I was introduced to a member of the BCI for Kids program and was later invited to join on as a patient partner for their current project. This study looks to use BCI and FES to improve the motor function of limb control impacted by a stroke, specifically in children, and making the therapy more accessible by incorporating social media as part of the therapy. My work as a patient partner has allowed me to actively work as a part of this project by testing the technology in its various development stages. I've also been able to conduct the qualitative interviews with the individuals participating in this research and get their firsthand experience using the technology. It has been an incredible opportunity, and I am so thankful for the work I have been able to be involved in. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Peyton. Thank you. That was just fantastic. So I'm Adam Kirton. I'm a pediatric neurologist here in Calgary, and Peyton, as you can tell, why we invited her is one of our just fabulous young adult patient partners and research team members, and so glad you could share your story, Peyton, and your obvious enthusiasm for the kind of work we're doing here in Calgary. By background, I've been here for almost 20 years, and we have a clinical research program. My background is, obviously pediatric neurology, and I have a strong interest in stroke, especially perinatal stroke. And we've been doing research here on that disorder for many years, but it really took us into the neurorehab world, where we really like to use technology to understand how young brains develop, and then try to use technology to help young people participate in life in ways that they couldn't before. That's really the theme of our team here. I'm very lucky to lead a large team. I'll introduce you to some of them in the talk I'll give in a minute. And you'll see we're very multidisciplinary and diverse. You heard Peyton is an aspiring young engineer. We have amazing technical people and trainees and young learners like her, all the way to clinical experts and other types of researchers that allow us to do the kind of work we're trying to do. And I hope this will be of interest to what I understand this audience to be. I think what I want to share with you is the progress we've made, really about the ways we think that technologies can help a variety, as you'll see, a variety of challenges that young people face with different types of brain injury early in life. And so with that, I'll just share my slides here. Okay, if I can just get a thumbs up. All right, look, Mara, Peyton looks good. Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. So I'll start with a bit of clinical background just to sort of set the stage, and then we'll get into the rehab and the tech. There'll be lots of time for questions at the end. You can throw them in the chat, and should be lots of time for discussion. So this is how my interest in stroke started many years ago as a young fellow, and still is today. And it's how a lot of stories, patient stories, start. This is an MRI scan of a one-day-old baby who was born to a healthy mom after a normal pregnancy and nothing out of the ordinary, and had a seizure on the first day of life. And that's why they went for the MRI. And the MRI shows, for those who aren't familiar, this is called diffusion MRI. So bright is bad. This is a really big stroke. So it's actually the left side of the brain. That's the entire middle cerebral artery. Everything bright here has just recently been injured. And all of that brain tissue is going to be lost. And this is a big brain injury. If you or I had this stroke, we would be very impaired in our motor function, probably cognitive, language, vision. And this young child will grow up to have some difficulty. They'll have some motor weakness on one side, a type of cerebral palsy. But amazingly, a lot of kids, despite such a big brain injury early in life, can do remarkably well. And there are some incredible young people that we follow in our program, other patient partners, people like Alana and Mike. I think I saw one of your upcoming topics is about sports and sport participation. These two and others have become high performance athletes despite these perinatal strokes. They're also great young adults now. They're patient partners. They're going to school. They're accomplishing amazing things. But even with a physical disability, they're traveling the world and winning medals for Canada at the Paralympics. Just a striking example of the potential and the success that young people can have. They're also the outliers, right? They've done exceptionally well. Most other kids have bigger challenges, and that's really what we're focused on. And we want to understand, and one theme for today is how do they do that? How does a young brain perform so well after such a bad injury? And it's not so much about the bright parts, it's actually all about all these light gray parts, which are pristine, healthy brain at the beginning of life, full of potential. And we're learning how all that healthy brain can adjust and adapt to help kids participate, achieve their goals, and become successful young adults. So that's kind of the big picture story. So I'll go over three kind of main objectives. I'll give you a little update about perinatal stroke, which is our main focus here, but the general rules certainly apply to stroke later in childhood, as well as other types of brain injury in children, and how the brain develops and how we're trying to learn that. And then because I was asked to talk about technology, I'll focus on that, and I'll show you a bunch of different really neat neurotechnologies that are rapidly advancing that help us understand these kids' brains, measure them, map them, but then also maybe help their brains and their bodies to function or participate at a higher level. And that'll include brain stimulation and brain computer interfaces and some really neat technology that hopefully you find interesting. I don't have any real disclosures here. I'm not going to try and sell you anything. I am a co-founder of a startup company, which I'll mention at the end. I'll show you how important we think that is to achieving these goals. But the company's not worth anything. They don't pay me. I promise I have no conflicts. So perinatal stroke is the disease we'll talk about the most. This is as I think this audience knows, it's very common. There's over 100,000 kids currently living in North America with a perinatal stroke. And perinatal stroke, by definition, means a focal vascular brain injury that occurs in the perinatal period. So in the fetus or in the newborn, very, very much the beginning of life. And what's shown on the bottom, this is a nice review article by Mary Dunbar, who's a faculty member with us here now. The pictures at the bottom are showing are these different injuries. Some are ischemic, like a lack of blood flow. Some are hemorrhages, like a breakage of a blood vessel. Some are recognized at birth. Some are recognized a bit later, like Payton shared in her story. But the point is that there's been usually a single injury in one spot in the brain. And as I mentioned, the rest of the brain is perfect. It's healthy. It's very capable. So that's what makes perinatal stroke such an informative group of diseases that help us understand how young brains recover. And so we don't need to get into the details of the neurology. I will make a couple comments just because people invariably want to know, and just as a brief update about perinatal stroke. As I mentioned, it's very common. This is data from Mary here. We're very lucky in Alberta here. We have a universal healthcare. We have a population-based sample. So we've really defined the epidemiology of the different types of perinatal stroke. You can see Mary's paper if you're interested. It's about 1 in 1,000 live births if you add up all the types together, which is actually much more common than we used to think.
You guys can open that one on
So-
your.
I can open it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
think
out of the chart.
somebody
Just-
needs to-
Yeah.
I can't see who that is. Everyone can mute your microphone, thanks. So it's a big problem, and unfortunately, we can't really prevent it or make it go away. So I think it's going to be a big problem for a long time. Don't worry about all these research papers. Don't try to read them. The point is, there's a lot of research about what causes perinatal stroke. We're still figuring that out. When it comes to arterial strokes, that is a blockage of an artery in the brain, which is the most common. It almost always is due to a placental problem. So this is a blood clot in the placenta that late in pregnancy goes to the baby's brain, blocks the artery, causes the stroke. There are a variety of conditions that can do this. There's no way to prevent it. There's no way a mom can know it's happening. There's no way, has nothing to do with what a mom does during her pregnancy. These are random events that unfortunately can't be predicted or prevented. And we have new treatments for perinatal stroke. We have better ways of detecting it, diagnosing it, and we even have some experimental treatments. This is the Dinosaur trial, which is a neuroprotective trial we're participating in, led out of the Netherlands, using a drug called darbepoetin to see if it can protect the brain. This sweet little girl is now, I think, almost 5. She was our first enrollee. The trial's almost finished. I mention it not to get into how we treat neonatal stroke, but just to say it's exciting. There are new trials happening. People are trying to find ways to prevent the stroke, protect the brain. But unfortunately, that's a really tall task, and I think it's going to be a long time before we can ever prevent or reduce the damage from neonatal stroke in a big way. All that to say, that's why rehab is so important, that we're going to have to deal with these injuries and the effects that they have on children's brain development. And so that's for all those reasons, that's where our focus has been, and that's what we'll talk about today. This is an MRI of another child. Same story, some seizures in the first days of life. This time the MRI, instead of a blockage of an artery, it shows a breakage of an artery. So this is a hemorrhage. This is blood into the brain. And we're making progress there too. We're understanding some of the reasons that this happens. There's a long list. I won't get into it. But just because I always get asked, and I think this audience might be of interest, it's true for hemorrhages is where it's asked most often, but it's true for all types of perinatal stroke. People always used to wonder and worry, is this due to trauma? My baby's birth was very difficult and it wasn't what I expected. And we've always known that it doesn't make sense that trauma would cause these strokes, but we've just published this study last year that really proves the point. I won't get into the details, but the take-home message is that trauma, the physical forces of labor, delivery, how a baby was born, really are not the cause of any of these types of perinatal stroke. And I think that's an important message for the general community. It's a common misperception that it might be. I'll give you an example in a minute. So just an important message that I wanted this audience to hear. Before we get into the technology of rehab, the other really important part of caring for children and families is addressing the mental health concerns that often occur in parents, moms in particular, and then children as they grow up. This starts in the NICU or when we make these diagnoses early in life. It turns out it's a huge problem. There's some really nice work about to come out from the group there in Boston that we work with about these long-term psychological outcomes. But if you're interested in more, there's a paper here. You can go to our website. We have some free whiteboard videos. I'm showing some screenshots here explaining about how these strokes are not predictable or preventable, and they're not the fault of the parents, especially the mom who worries they did something wrong. And it can really be quite devastating. And so we spend a lot of time focused on education and reassurance and mental health. Really important. So please check that out on the website if you're interested. And related to that, and this group is another really nice example, or it's a growing number of supports for families affected by stroke and brain injury in childhood. Here are some of the ones that we partner with. Mary Kay's here from IAPS in the bottom left. She's also part of our International Pediatric Stroke Organization, top left, which now has a community-based page. We work with Heart and Stroke and the American Heart Association, Fight the Stroke, and a variety of groups. And so I think this audience is probably quite familiar with this, but these are the kinds of support networks that I think, you heard about lifts, Payton mentioned, that's our local support group. So I think these things are just extremely important in rehab and don't need much technology at all. This is about support at the level of the community and families, and can't underestimate the importance of that. And lastly, on that note, about supporting and educating families, we're trying to find new ways to do that. I just gave you some resources that do that. You also have to just be really careful about what you read. And this is a huge problem. I'm not going to get political and talk about your new president, but the truth is hard to find, let's just say, these days. And it's true even in our world where we're trying to get good information out. This is the current page, the Wikipedia page on perinatal stroke. The first thing it says is that birth trauma may causes strokes in babies, which is just not true. And it's the first thing you might read if you hear about your child or a child has had a stroke. You go to Wikipedia and this is what you find. So be careful, and we're working on this. We're trying to counter the misinformation, but I think it's a huge problem that the general community really needs to be aware of and needs to consider in how they acquire and interpret information that is in some ways just too available. It's just too easy for bad information to get out there. Okay, I said I was going to talk about technology. Now I'm going to talk about technology. So those are my just sort of update messages about the world of perinatal stroke. So now let's think about the baby I showed you at the beginning, or any child who's had a perinatal stroke. What is their brain going to do? How are they going to develop around this injury? And so if we think about development from left to right here, you're born over here, and let's say you're an adult at 18 or 25. And development usually follows curves like this. So we all went through stages where we were little and our brains developed like crazy, and we learned to walk and talk and run and go to school. And then everything slows down, of course, at 18. It's all downhill after 25. Sorry to tell you. And what happens when you introduce a focal brain injury back here at the beginning of life, the perinatal time frame? And what we've learned from all of our experience so far is that, of course, no child is the same. They're all unique individuals, and so the outcomes will vary, even though they've had what looks like the same injury at the same time in their life. And we see kids, I've shown you a few already, who are doing great, and that you might call that a good stroke. They're high functioning. They might have some issues, some disability from their stroke, but they're succeeding in life. They're participating. That's what I would call a good stroke. And unfortunately, some kids struggle much more, and some even start off really well and get into trouble and end up with an outcome that is perhaps not as optimal as it could be. And so our goal in our program is to try to understand that and think of ways to understand the factors that push individual kids up or down these curves. How do we nudge them up onto a steeper curve so they ultimately do better, or at least prevent them from drifting down? And you can see I've listed here a variety of factors. Some of them we can't control, like genetics. But what about experience and therapy and maybe what we call neuromodulation? These are possibly some ways we can help kids do better, especially if we help them early. We think the earlier the better. You can imagine if I change the slope of this curve down here by just a couple of degrees, it might end up with a much bigger and better outcome as they become a young adult. So what are the outcomes from perinatal stroke? We'll focus on the motor system because that's the most common morbidity. So that's hemiparetic or unilateral cerebral palsy is usually due to a perinatal stroke, and it's the most common outcome. Even the kids with the large arterial strokes, like I showed you at the beginning, many will avoid other complications. It might only be the motor difficulty. About 1 in 3 will end up with other challenges like learning difficulties, not usually language. Language is amazing at reorganizing, but other challenges like epilepsy or vision loss or mental health or behavior problems, attention. And so the morbidity of perinatal stroke is broad. It varies by individual. The good news, one of the few pieces of good news is that the recurrence risk is virtually zero. Remember, most of these are due to a problem from the placenta, so it doesn't recur. So if we think about the motor system, I know this is a general audience and we're not going to get into the neurology, but if you're interested, and this is where technology has been helpful, what I'm showing in this cartoon on the left is just a simplification of how your motor system, your movement system works in your brain. And I'll orient you because it sort of explains the next few slides I'll show you about how the technology works. So if we're looking here, this is obviously not to scale, but this is supposed to be like I'm looking at someone's brain. And so this is the right side of their brain and the left side. And we all have a motor cortex. So this is the right motor cortex. And in probably most people on this call, your right motor cortex sends projections down to your spinal cord, and then your spinal cord sends nerves out to your hand on the opposite side of your body, right? Your right brain controls your left hand. But if you've had a stroke at the beginning of life, that's the red X here. Now those pathways have been damaged. Some of them still are probably getting through, but many may not. And so instead, what your brain sometimes will do, and I'll show you a video in a sec, is when you're born, you actually have connections on the same side of your body, from, in this case, the right motor cortex to the right hand. That's what's indicated by the dashed line. In most of us, those connections actually withdraw in normal development in the first few years. But if you've had an injury on the other side, what will sometimes happen is these will persist. We call them ipsilateral projections. They're on the same side. And this is getting a little too neurology for you, sorry, but the take-home point is, you can imagine, is that some kids with perinatal stroke, because they couldn't use their left side to do all the work, they now have this sort of shared relationship where they have these connections. They might actually be using, to some degree, the right side of their brain to control their right hand. And we've learned that many kids are actually using a combination of both. They're using the left and the right side. But understanding this, we think, is important. If we know what the brain's trying to do, maybe we can figure out better ways to help it. And that's where the technology comes in. So how do we do that? Well, we use technology. So advanced neuroimaging, that's mostly MRI scans, is an amazing field that has expanded incredibly in the last 10 or 20 years. And what I'm showing you here, don't worry about the terms. It's a bunch of pretty pictures, but they're these different modalities or different types of imaging that we can do to try to answer that question. What are each of these kids' brains doing as they grow up? And we can look at the structure and the connectivity and the pathways in the brain and how they've been altered by the stroke, and then compare that to how the kid functions in the real world. How strong are they? What deficits do they have? How are they achieving things? We can put those two things together to figure out what a good strategy is in a young brain and what a strategy that maybe doesn't work as well is, and figure out ways to obviously enhance the former. So these are just some more pretty pictures. This is called functional MRI. So kids are in the scanner and we get them to tap their fingers on one side and the other side and both sides. And using special technology, it can light up the activity in the brain. That's what these red and green and blue dots are. They're showing how kids have moved their motor control on both sides of their brain. And some of these other orange pictures are showing that the connectivity and networks within the brain has been altered between normal kids who have this kind of pattern, but kids with stroke, you can see, have different patterns. This is all measuring how the motor control is moving around. It's the motor system in your brain isn't just about your motor cortex and the pathway I showed you. There's other parts like the thalamus and the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. These are all part of your motor development. And sure enough, when we do these studies like I'm showing you here, we find alterations. So, sorry, I think somebody's unmuted. If you can mute, please, thanks. It turns out the whole motor system is different. And to look at it on an MRI, it looks like it's pretty normal, but when we measure it carefully, we see it's actually changed during development. Especially in the way I showed you on the very first MRI, there's the stroke side of the brain where obviously there are changes, but the biggest changes are actually happening in the other hemisphere. That healthy side of the brain is growing differently, and how it does that seems to be very important for function. And again, don't try to just take these in as pretty pictures that are, you have to trust me, they're showing us something. This is Helen Carlson's work, and you can see that this is not even looking at the stroke side of the brain. We're just looking at the structure on the non-stroke side, which looks normal at first on the MRI. And when you measure it very carefully here, what we show is that kids with strokes compared to those who don't have alterations all over the other side of their brain. Different functional parts of the brain are growing and developing differently because of the stroke that happened on the other side. And how they do that seems to be very important for how they function, their motor system, but also other brain functions. This is Brandon Craig's work with Helen, and it's looking now in the brain at the pathways, the highways of information in the brain. We call this structural connectivity. This is just another type of MRI technique, but you can see these beautiful pictures, but it really gives us deep information about how everything is connected and talking. Again, only in the intact or non-lesioned hemisphere. And these differences in the network are very strongly correlated with how kids are functioning in their daily life. And so we really think it's telling us something. So just really nice examples of how technology is informing our understanding. So that was imaging. The other tool we like to use is called non-invasive brain stimulation. This one's called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the idea is pretty straightforward. This is Aiden, who you'll meet again in a minute. This is both of us looking much younger. And we use a TMS machine in our lab, and TMS delivers a little magnetic pulse over your motor cortex and doesn't feel like much. But if we hit the right spot, it will activate that motor pathway I showed you, and it'll make the muscle jump, and we can measure that. And so we can do brain mapping using TMS to figure out how kids have organized their brains This is safe, painless. We've done over 5 million stimulations here in over 400 children with different brain conditions. No serious side effects, no seizures. So it's a great tool. And here's a paper from our group. And again, don't worry about the graphs. Just look at this cartoon up here. This little cartoon here. This is we call it the coil. This is where the TMS comes from. So this is the same cartoon I showed you a few slides ago. There's the stroke. So remember, on the healthy side of the brain, there may still be connections to the weak hand, the hand affected by the stroke. And imaging can tell us that to some degree, but TMS is even more informative. If we give a stimulation here and both hands jump, or the muscles activate in both hands, right away I know that this young person has these ipsilateral connections. And this was a group of, I think, about 40 kids, and you can see some of them do and some of them don't. And it turns out whether you do or you don't has an influence on, these bottom graphs are showing how well their hands work. It affects your motor function. So right away, pretty simple experiment, but the technology tells us at the individual level, how is your brain wired? How have you adjusted to your perinatal stroke? And I don't know if we have any therapists on the line, but any parents or people with lived experience might recognize what these are. They're called mirror movements. So these two young kids in my clinic have had perinatal strokes, and this young guy, I'm asking him to just tap his left hand, and he's looking at his left hand, but watch what his right hand does at the same time. He can't stop that. He has almost perfect mirror movements of his right hand when he tries to.
Good. Now both hands up again.
Back to the cartoon on the top right here, that's because he's using the right side of his brain to control both hands. So when he sends a signal to the left hand, the signal also goes to the right hand. So these mirror movements are telling us a lot about how they're wired. It turns out that correlates very well with the TMS studies and the imaging. Not so good that we can tell exactly how the child has wired their motor system. But we hope someday, if we get good enough, maybe we don't need all the fancy scans and technology. We could just see them in the clinic for 2 minutes and understand how they're connected. We're not quite there yet, but that's the idea. And TMS is the technology. The focus of today is getting even better. This is a TMS robot in our lab. I used to do all this by hand, as you saw in the picture. We can now do it in an automated way, integrated with the patient's own MRI scan. We can have the robot go around and stimulate spots and generate what's shown here. This heat map it's a representation of the activation of one muscle in one hand of one child. So it's almost like a fingerprint. It's very unique, very personalized. It's showing how the brain activates this muscle. And so the technology here has become increasingly useful. We can integrate that with neuroimaging to try to put the whole picture together, and teaches us a lot. A few other types of technology we use to understand how kids are functioning. This is called the KinArm robot. And all these studies I'm showing on the left are how we've used the robot in kids with perinatal stroke. It can measure motor function, but it's really good at measuring sensory function. So how do young people know where their arm is in space, or how is it moving in space? So that's the sensation of movement, not making movement happen. And it turns out that's really important. It's harder to measure in the clinic, and that's where the robots become very helpful. It might even be a therapy. So this young lady here did some of her therapy after she had a big stroke as a teenager, using the KinArm robot, and she's now doing great. Not necessarily because of the robot, but just to say that robotics is becoming an increasingly used technology for neurorehab in kids with brain injury. So to sum up that whole story, the message is that we can use technology, imaging, brain stimulation, robots to understand how each young kid's brain has developed after a perinatal stroke. This is a review article that we published a few years ago that goes into probably more detail than you would ever want about that story. But if you're interested, I'd refer you there. That these color cartoons are showing is all the different pieces of the puzzle that are sort of coming together about how kids recover from perinatal stroke. So keep that just concept in mind. And we'll move on to the last part. And it's really about taking what we learn with the technology, which is all very interesting, but trying to translate it into something that actually matters to kids and families. And how do we use the technology to help them function better, participate, do things they want to do that they haven't been able to do because of their disability. And so we'll talk about two of those, non-invasive brain stimulation first, and then brain-computer interfaces and how that can help. So how do we currently try to help kids who've had perinatal stroke and have cerebral palsy on one side? You might be familiar with Iona Novak's system. So the Australian group leads the world in how we do rehab in kids with CP and motor deficits. They have this stoplight system. Here's all the therapies anybody's ever thought of. It turns out there's only a few up at the top here that get big green circles, which means we have good evidence, they're safe, effective, and this really drives what we do for therapy these days. You can see people are trying all sorts of things, and the evidence for most of them is pretty poor. So it's safe to say we do have some good treatments, but they're not terribly effective, and we clearly need better treatments for disability after early life brain injury. So again, focusing on hemiparesis, or the one-sided cerebral palsy. So a lot of the deficits are most felt in the upper extremity. So a lot of therapies are directed there. And currently we have some evidence-based treatments, things like constraint therapy. So this young boy restraining the good hand and arm so that the other side works harder, so to speak. And things like bimanual therapy, teaching kids how to integrate their two hands together. There's good evidence that these are quite effective. They're delivered broadly across the world. But how good are they? This is an interesting study from Scandinavia recently that showed, and again, don't worry too much about the graphs. The point is that these are kids who received early intensive therapies like this, and they're followed. Their AHA score is on the y-axis here. That's a measure of bimanual function in kids with hemiparesis. You can see that their scores, of course, go up as they age. Here they are going from preschool to teen years. And the red group does a bit better than the blue group, and they got intensive therapy. But the overall effect is really quite modest. So the change in AHA score, it's statistically significant, but it's not that many points. And so if I showed you kids in these two groups side by side, it would be hard for you probably to tell the difference. So far from a cure, it still helps. It's still definitely meaningful. It's definitely worth doing, but it just sort of highlights the need that we need to figure out how to do more. So back to our models that I showed you, we understand maybe what these kids' brains are doing. We can measure that. What would we do? Well, if we know there's a particular node in their network or a spot in their brain that's very important, if it's trying to learn how to do function, could we enhance that or stimulate it to do it better? This is the idea of neuromodulation. And so TMS, which I already introduced you to, can also be given repetitively. That's what this boy is doing in a trial that we did. And in adults with stroke and other conditions, it's been shown to modulate the brain. And when it's combined with therapy, like Alana's doing here, it might be able to enhance motor function. So we do clinical trials. That's the only way to find out if something works. And this is just one of the earlier trials we did to give you an idea of what that looks like. So you collect a group of children with the same problem, and you invite them to participate in a trial. You measure them very carefully at baseline, their physical function and their brain maps. And then our approach, and other people have done similar, is to doing very intensive therapy camps over a couple of weeks, all day, every day, goal-directed, peer-supported. We do them here in our hospital. And if all the kids get a really big dose of good, best available therapy, then we could add on something like a neuromodulation treatment, or a placebo version of that. So if that's the only difference, that would allow us to tell if the treatment's doing anything. And then we follow them very carefully out to usually at least 6 months. And so this is done in a camp model. These are snapshots from the original camp we did. Kids, of course, they're not going to just do therapy all day, so it has to be very creative. And thanks to our OTs and child life therapists, they have these great activities. This is rock band and sports and cooking. And we really get them to work their brains, try to work on that hand. And they all set their own goals. And so that's one of our primary measures of how they do in these trials. And this was called the Plastic Champs trial. This was TMS. And I won't bore you with all the details, but the point of this graph, this is called the COPM, the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure. These are goals, kids and parents ranking how well am I doing at this goal that I set. And at baseline, you can, I think, see there's a scale from 0 to 10. These are box plots. So the black line here is the average. This was 45 kids. And you can see they give it a 3 out of 10 before they start, because that's why it's a goal. They're not very good at it. And after the camp, it more than doubles, which is a big improvement. And 6 months later, it doesn't fade. It actually gets a little bit stronger, which is great. So the kids, from their subjective perception, they feel like they've achieved their goal. They're doing better than they were before, which is great. And then we also measure it objectively with tests like the AHA, which I mentioned earlier. I don't want to get too into the graphs here. The point here is that this is showing change from baseline. All the kids improve at least a little, so that's good. And this group at the end was the one that got brain stimulation, the real version, plus at the time constraint therapy. They seem to be the most likely to have a bigger gain in their AHA scores at 6 months. So it was a suggestion that brainstem was feasible, and it seemed to be potentially helpful. So we've gone on to do other trials since then with another type of brainstem called TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation. This is simpler, so it's a box connected to 2 sponge electrodes. It's a bit of electricity over the surface of your scalp, and a little bit of that goes down and tickles the surface of the brain. And this had been shown in adults to enhance motor learning, so healthy adults and also adults with stroke. So we did some proof of principle type trials. This is Pat Jahinsky's work. Again, sorry for all the graphs, but this one's pretty straightforward. If you watch these, you can see there's 4 lines here. These are kids learning a motor task. They're actually putting pegs in a board as fast as they can. And the open triangles are the sham or the control group. So these are just regular kids just practicing. And you can see that they learn, the curve goes up. And after 3 days of practice, they can put 2 more pegs in the board in, I think it's 30 seconds. And if you test them again 6 weeks later, that's called retention time, their skill is the same. It's definitely better than it was before they started. So that's learning. That's motor learning. The top 3 curves, the kid, instead of getting fake TDCS, the top 3 curves got 3 different types of what we call active TDCS. And you can see that they learned better. They were actually putting 4 more pegs in the board. And it also lasted, was still there at 6 weeks. So this had been shown in adults, but we wanted to prove the principle in kids. It's safe, it's well tolerated. We did another study, replicated this using some other types of TDCS. So we had some good reason to think that might be true. And then we did what's called a phase 2 trial. So this was 24 kids. Now we've moved to kids with perinatal stroke and hemiparesis. This was an after-school program, so they didn't get huge doses of therapy. But we thought we saw some signal that suggested the kids who got active TDCS were more likely to achieve their goals. And so that led to the sport trial, which we just finished. It'll be published in about 2 weeks. This is pretty exciting for pediatric rehab. So this is what's called a phase 3 multi-center randomized control trial. It's a mouthful. But what it means is we're all the way to like trying to do the trial that will show, does this actually work? And can you do it across multiple centers for lots of kids? This was almost 90 children in the trial. And it runs, I won't go through these details, similar to the approach I showed you before, an intensive 2-week camp, careful measurement before and after, randomized to get either active TDCS over the motor cortex or a fake version of TDCS, which feels the same. The kids can't tell the difference. This is how we decide if it works. And here's some snapshots from the camp. Again, lots of fun. And that's too much detail. Just skip over it. Here are the main results of the sport trial. What it showed was that the AHA, the measurement of their hand function, and the goal measure, the COPM, everything improved quite dramatically, in fact. So these dashed lines are showing what's considered a clinically significant change in these scores from 0 at baseline. And the function was better, their goal achievement was excellent, which is very exciting. So we got these big improvements in the entire cohort of children. But what we also found was that adding TDCS, at least the way we chose to do it, wasn't able to add on to that. It wasn't able to produce any additional benefit. And if you're not used to looking at graphs, all I'm saying is that the 2 colored lines in both of these, one group is the real TDCS, one is the sham. They are not different from each other. So the 2 groups, both groups did well. The stimulation didn't make a significant difference. So this is a big step in the field. It would have been nice if it had some great bonus, some big effect of TDCS, but it also tells us that, and I think this is an important message for the community that will be part of our knowledge translation, is that at least the way we currently know how to do it, brain stimulation right now isn't a big bonus. It's not, at least in this format, it's not able to do what we hoped it could, so that parents don't feel they're missing out if they're not getting their child brain stimulation. There are, I think, people on this call who are actively pursuing the next levels of this. And I think there's, as has happened in the adult stroke world, all sorts of different ways that we can do this. This now proves that this is safe, feasible, well tolerated. So I think that world is going to continue to expand. We're just not there yet. We do get great outcomes like this. This is a text message spontaneously, I think on the second or third day of camp, from one young participant. His mom texts us, he's so excited, he thinks he can move his thumb better, and I want the camp to last a month instead of 2 weeks. And so he is growing and gaining and thinks he's improving, and he is. And so these outcomes are great. These are snapshots from the water gun fight on the last day of the camp. This is participation, right? These are kids doing normal kid things, shooting me with a water gun. And if you looked closely, you'd be like, oh, that kid's having trouble holding the water gun. Oh, his arm and hand look weak. But that's only if you looked too closely, right? If you looked at first, you'd be like, that looks like a bunch of kids participating, right? Having fun, doing something normal. That's really the goal. So all of this progress in perinatal stroke rehab is translating out. Alicia, I see you here. Hi, welcome. Feel free to jump in and answer questions at the end. A lot of this is Alicia's work on our team, translating everything I just showed you into the real world. So implementation studies, home-based rehab, parent-driven, trying to figure out how to implement and get access to things like early constraint therapy across our country and Canada, which turns out to be really difficult. She's been leading the charge in those lines of research. And these are the things that need to happen. Here's a real world example. This is Jack, who, as you can see, he had a stroke like this. I'll just play the video. And you'll, I'm sure, can appreciate that he's a very cute 9-month-old here. His left side obviously is not moving very much compared to the right. He's cheating. He's crossing the midline with his, he's not accusing him of cheating. He's doing what comes naturally. And he really wants this giraffe. And grandma's helping out by just gently restraining his side, and he can move his left side. You can see he has trouble opening his hand. Obviously wants it, but he just can't get it. Now he's going to get frustrated.
Okay, you can let it go.
We don't torture him.
Jack, who's this guy?
Let him grab it, and then he'll be able to.
There you go.
So the point of showing Jack is really how clinical research is changing things in this field. Jack is at this video was in all 3 of these studies at the same time. The neuroprotection trial, the home-based early therapy in the upper extremity, and a treadmill study that'll be published soon, showing how the lower extremity might be improved by early intervention. This is the future of pediatric stroke rehab, certainly for perinatal stroke. And it's really about, I've said participation a lot. I just want to emphasize, I think this audience knows what I mean, but if you think about the ICF model, that's how do we think about disability and rehab? I'm a neurologist, so I was trained to think about body structure and function. Like, I can examine you and say, this is how strong your leg is. These are your reflexes. I've learned from therapists and patients and families that just really doesn't matter. I think what matters is activity. Who cares if your leg is weak? What do you want to do? I want to ride a bike. Okay, let's get you riding the bike. That's what matters. And even more so, what matters is participation. So not only why do you want to ride a bike? I want to go biking with my friends. That if they can do that, that's the win. That's participation. And so this audience probably knows that, but it took me 20 years to get there. So I thought I should share it. And the young adult outcomes we're learning, this is Lauren Cole's a pediatric neurology resident, former grad student of ours in Edmonton. She's doing a long-term adult outcome study. She's tracking down all the kids who are now in their 20s, some are in their 30s. And we don't have her data yet, and I don't want to steal her thunder. She'll be coming out with it soon. But we're finding that these high rates of life achievement, even in kids with difficult strokes and physical disabilities, very high rates of finishing school, employment, getting married, having kids, driving a car. Here's Aiden, if you remember from that picture of me doing TMS. He's now a young adult. He just finished a degree, and now he wants to be an occupational therapist. He just emailed us, said, how do I become an occupational therapist? I want to help kids with disabilities. So this kind of participation in life I'm generalizing a bit. Some kids definitely have bigger challenges, need more help. but the potential of kids to achieve these things is clearly is excellent with the right amount of help. Okay, in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to just switch gears and tell you about the newest technology, which is called brain-computer interface. And this has applications in perinatal stroke and stroke in children, but also other types of brain injury. And Payton, different Payton, this young lady's name is also Payton. She also had a stroke around birth, but unfortunately she had two. So this is her MRI, and her strokes are actually very small. They're a little bright spot here, a little bright spot here. But if you remember the cartoon I showed you, unfortunately, Payton has injured both of her corticospinal tracts. So now she doesn't have weakness on one side. She has lost motor control of both sides, her whole body, not just her arms and legs. She can't use her hands. She can't walk, but all of her speech muscles. She can't talk. But she is a highly capable young woman. She's 13 in this picture. Her cortex of her brain is intact. She's very smart. She's funny. She loves to hang out with her friends. She listen to music, make art. This is her actually making art with her brain. I'll show you how. And she's winning an award for that. And so this is where technology really, we have to have technology. We can't just rehabilitate or exercise or do some of the things we've talked about. This requires a quantum leap in neurotechnology, because this is sometimes called the locked-in syndrome. This is quadriplegic cerebral palsy, young people who are really trapped in their bodies, can't move, and usually can't speak. And so the technology here is a brain-computer interface, or BCI. And how it works is it samples your brain activity continuously, usually in our case, as you'll see, it's non-invasive, so using an EEG, and it sends your brain waves to a smart computer continuously. And then that computer can learn, as you tell it, that you are changing the activity in your brain intentionally. So if you just think about opening and closing your left hand, or even just look at this cartoon, it will activate your brain. It will change your brain waves in a predictable way. So much so that with a little bit of training, you could then do that on purpose. You could use that specific thought, and the computer would recognize and go, okay, what do you want me to do? And you could tell it, when I do that, I want you to move this computer cursor to the left, or turn on my computer, or roll my wheelchair. That's how brain-computer interface works. And it's not a new idea. These implantable BCIs, these two adults with severe disability have little chips in their brain. This has been done for several decades, and incredible things that these individuals can do, but it's extremely technically complicated and demanding. There's still only about 60 people in the world who have implanted brain-computer interfaces. None of them are children. This is BCI in 2025. So this is real. This is not fiction. These are people speaking by using just their brain waves. These are epilepsy patients. This is showing how the brain waves are measured to extract the thoughts of speech and turn them into speech. This is Krishna Shenoy's work in California. Same thing. These are adults who have lost their physical abilities, who used to know how to speak and write with their hand. They can think about writing letters, and the computer will write the letter. This is an Australian group that has invented the stentrode that can be put not even into your brain, just in the vein around your brain, and sense your brain activity. There are multiple patients implanted with this doing things just by thinking about it. And Neuralink has these threads that can be implanted. They implanted the first patient last year. Incredible control achievable with implantable BCI. So this is incredible technology progress. The problem is children have been left behind. So here's all the publications over the last 20 years. And if you can appreciate, there's this little sliver at the bottom. Most of these are from our group. Very few papers being published on BCI. There's a variety of reasons why children are being neglected and left behind. I've written about it if you're interested. That's the article. But what's clear is all of this progress in engineering and neuroscience and computer science is just not translating out to pediatric populations, which it turns out are a huge part of the long-term disability, severe disability population globally. And so with that in mind, we started doing some really simple BCI experiments. Here's my son a few years ago. He's wearing a wireless EEG system. It's talking to a computer. The computer's talking to this car. He was trained to think a go thought and asked to think that to make the car go. And you'll see him think it, the car goes, you'll see him smile here. And then we ask him to stop thinking it to make it stop on the square. And he thinks about something else and it stops. So super basic, but it works. And this is one study in a group of healthy school-age children. They can all do this about the same as an adult using different strategies. And so we quickly took this to our clinical program to work with families of children with severe disabilities, give them access to BCI, really basic BCI technology, but to try and show us and tell us, what do you want it to do? How do you want it to work? And that's been driving our BCI for Kids program for the last 5 years. I'm going to show you a few examples. I think we have time, but I'm going to start just with a short video from Claire and Stephanie, so you can hear it directly from a family.
Claire is a really fun kid, but she couldn't communicate to us kind of what she wanted to do. It was almost like we needed to be telepathic and make decisions for her and make choices for her. It's hard not to be able to hear your child's voice. Claire suffered lack of oxygen at birth, and so that resulted in cerebral palsy, which affects her motor skills and all her limbs in her body. It also affects her communication, so she cannot verbally speak. When Claire was 2.5, we went in to find ways that she could communicate. They introduced us to eye gaze, and we did some trials with some different machines, and over time, Claire learned how to say things. She learned how to introduce herself, saying, "Hi, I'm Claire." So the best thing that I got, Claire was 3.5, and we were playing, and she has a comment box, so she can say comments. So she went into comments, and she picked, "I love you," and then she went to Mom. So I got my first "I love you."
Most people, when they see a child with severe disability, they think a broken body must mean a broken brain or a broken mind. And very often that's not the case. And so their ability to connect to the outside world is very limited. It's extremely challenging, and it prevents them from being able to express themselves, to realize their full potential. And so they need a different way to use their brains to connect to the world.
BCI, or brain-computer interface, is a system where you wear a headset on your head. It has these little sensors that pick up your brain's electrical signals. The system then decodes those signals, and it can use those patterns to allow you to control things either on the computer or outside of the computer. So that's what Claire is doing right now. She's controlling this robotic ball using her thoughts.
I was very hopeful that it was a real technology. When you first hear brainwaves making something work, I thought it was very futuristic. And the first time that I saw her turn on a light, I was completely blown away.
BCI is creating these new opportunities for people who are trapped to connect with the real world independently in ways that matter to them. Seeing a young person move their wheelchair, make a painting, play a video game, things they could never do before and never thought they'd ever be able to do. And the look on their face when they do it and the look on their parents' face is extremely rewarding.
Now that Claire's doing BCI at home, we play board games with the family. She cooks a lot in the kitchen. She has a water gun that she loves to shoot everybody with. She has a dart gun so that she can play in the dart range with her brothers. So really anything that has power or that she did with our help, she can do by herself now. Claire being able to do things independently through BCI has really changed her personality. We're learning so many new things about her. Claire is cheeky. Claire is a really funny girl. She loves excitement. She's hit my ceiling with her milkshakes. So she'll wait till I take the lid off and then she'll think go, and she sprayed my ceiling. I never thought my 8-year-old would open a company. She started a cooking company with BCI, Claire's Kitchen, Food by Thought, and she's going to have a little YouTube channel, and she's going to put videos up of everything she makes to teach other kids that the possibilities are endless.
The BCI for Kids program here is at the front of this space in the world, and we would not be there without community support from Calgary and Southern Alberta.
Not long ago, brain-computer interface sounded like science fiction, and now it's just science. This is opening up a whole new world of opportunity for kids just like Claire to achieve their full potential. We're so grateful to have an amazing hospital filled with incredible bright minds, and with the community behind them and the generous support, the sky truly is the limit.
I think that our community recognizes the importance of technology and the importance of putting funds towards children like Claire, and that they can do things and can be a big part of our community. And if we give them the technology, they will thrive.
So thanks to Claire and Stephanie. Claire's actually the champion child for our hospital for the Miracle Network. And she's the first time a champion child has been nonverbal. And so they came and did that nice video that you just saw. So I realize we're pretty much out of time. So I'm just going to give you a little snapshot of the BCI program, and then we can open up for questions. We've now actually had 33 kids through the program, including many with stroke, but other causes of quadriplegia. As you saw, there's a home program. So kids are doing this in their regular lives at home as well as in the lab. Here's some examples. Here's Nick, who has quadriplegic CP, and he's racing cars with his brother, who's wearing a headset as well. And on the bottom right, he's playing video games with his brother, things that they could never do before. There's communication applications for BCI. This is a spelling board that nonverbal kids can use to spell words. This is power mobility, which I think I saw was coming up on your list of topics. So this is driving your wheelchair. This is just a trainer. This is Dan. You can see his joy when he gets his wheelchair to move using his BCI. Tay was able to do the same thing. BCI at home, you heard about. Amazing patient engagement experts on our team working with families. The families have been just unbelievable. This is called BCI Boccia. This is Dan, who's a postdoc in the lab. This is a Paralympic sport, if you weren't familiar, for people with disabilities, but not complete quadriplegia. So we're campaigning to add a level of boccia, and Dan and his team have built a BCI-controlled boccia ramp that will hopefully see kids with quadriplegia be able to go to the Paralympics someday. There's a lot of other work going on because pediatric BCI is really new, but it's really exciting. And the last thing I wanted to come back to, because I wanted to circle all the way back to Payton to close the loop. We've talked about perinatal stroke, hemiparesis. Now we're talking about BCI. BCI might actually be able to help with hemiparesis, and Payton's been one of our patient partners. So the idea here is that we use those brain waves to connect to the command that is trying to get a hemiparetic limb to work, and try to connect that and help the limb work better, maybe with functional electrical stimulation. And we're just launching a new study. This is a study from Siena that showed that kids with large strokes on one side can use a BCI, no problem. But how do we connect that back to their weak arm? And so she did this pilot study. This is connecting the child trying to move their paretic limb in a desired way and pairing their brain wave activity to help them do that better. The problem is it works, it's well tolerated, but it's super boring. And so Anna Bourgeois on our team, and with Payton's help, we've designed a new system that actually they have to, in order to flip their social media on the screen, they have to do their desired movement, create the right brain signal. So how do you motivate teenagers to do something over and over and over and over again? You put it on, you make it TikTok or YouTube or whatever their choice is. So this pilot study is just underway. Stay tuned, but we're very excited. Just a few final resources for you. So implantable BCI, that the type that's probably going to ultimately be hugely impactful, is years away from children, but we've started that process. We hosted the first international summit. It's online for free. Just search implantable BCIs for children, and you can hear all these experts from around the world who are experts in implants talk about where that's going. And I'll skip over the technology part only to say that part of this, getting this technology and any, I think, neuro rehab technology to scale and be available to kids everywhere is going to involve commercialization and technology. And so we've started down that path as well. We have this small startup company for this first device, and it's taught us how we integrate, that's what this picture is showing, clinical research with clinical care, but also scaling and commercialization. Happy to talk about that or answer questions, but I just wanted people to be aware. Okay, so there's Payton. This is really what it's all about. Payton was one of our pioneers in the BCI program. You saw her winning that award. She made a painting one day in the lab. We have many of these paintings now from her and other kids, but she made something that was hers. It was an original. She'd never been able to do it before. That's participation, and that's really what it's all about. So I'll end with that. Thanks to my team, many of whom I've mentioned and are shown here in our funding. And thank you to other Payton for coming and for sharing. If you want more information, here's some websites I'll leave up: perinatalstroke.ca, bciforkids.com. If BCI's caught your attention, we're actually hosting the World BCI Society meeting in beautiful Banff here in June. Registration's open now. Abstracts are due next week. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Adam. We'll leave this slide up just for a moment and then ask everyone to come on camera if you're able to, and I'll facilitate questions. So I think, Dana, if you're still here, your question is first.
Am I to read? I haven't been able to monitor the chat. I can go through
No,
that.
no, I'm
Anybody want
seeing
to
if
unmute?
Dana's still here. I don't see Dana. So Dana had asked if these technologies also apply to kids who have a stroke in childhood, not in the perinatal phase.
Yeah, I'll answer for each of the ones I showed you. So for the brainstem approach, for the hemiparesis, I mentioned that we've gotten it to a phase 3 trial. That was partly our bias because we've always been focused on perinatal. It also has some of the largest populations. So I think that sort of happened naturally. The basic principles, I think, likely apply to children who maybe had a stroke 5 or 10 years later and end up with similar problems. But we're further behind in the evidence. I guess we don't know yet. But I think that a similar approach is required. For BCI that I showed at the end, I think we certainly see, I think I mentioned there's a variety of disorders that can create that scenario of quadriplegia. That includes strokes at all ages. We've had kids in the program who've had childhood strokes, hemorrhages. So I think it is an even more generally applicable approach. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks. I see Audrey's still here. Audrey, do you want to come on camera and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, thank you. And I had so many questions. This was amazing. Thank you for doing this. So I'm wondering, and the second half of your presentation kind of answered this, but for the first part, I think it was, can you tell me the name of the TMS? Is it TMS?
TMS is that, yeah.
So if the child had a hemispherectomy where the motor strip is completely disconnected, I'm assuming that would not work.
Well, first I'll say that we don't know that it works for anybody yet. It's still considered experimental. You're right that their pathways will be different. It depends why they had a hemispherectomy, at what age, and those ipsilateral connections that I tried to highlight that happen in a lot of kids with perinatal stroke certainly play some role in how kids with hemispherectomy function. And so I think it's fair to say some of the rules, I hesitate to call them rules because we know they vary a lot, but some of the concepts that I put out there about how one side of the brain tries to compensate for the other with a bad injury certainly apply to children with hemispherectomy who, I guess have the most extreme version of that where they've, completely lost the other hemisphere. So I think we can borrow from what we're learning in the more common stroke scenarios. But I'd hesitate to say they're obviously not exactly the same either.
Yeah. And is the BCI research only being done in stroke or all populations with quadriplegia? And
so for quadriplegia, it's completely, I think I mentioned we have 33 families in the program. I think we have about 24 separate underlying diagnoses. So kids have all sorts of different causes of quadriplegia. For the hemiparesis, we've only started that very early work in perinatal stroke, children with perinatal stroke, just because that's who we work with. That's who we know, that's who participates in our studies. I think, again, the concepts could certainly be borrowed to other forms of either hemiparesis due to stroke later in childhood or other causes of hemiparetic cerebral palsy. I think we've started with the population that we know, but it would hopefully extend from there.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions.
Dana again had asked about the camps and who is able to participate. Is it limited to Alberta citizens or Canadian citizens or?
Yeah, it's I think there's a couple of answers there. So the ones I've shown you were all part of funded clinical trials where we could only, and it's a bit different than the US model, so we only recruit from our local population. Or the sport trial I mentioned was multi-center, so that was Calgary, Edmonton, and Toronto. Families were only from those geographical areas. We use the camp-based model because it's well suited for doing a trial, especially if you're doing an intervention like I described. Many people are probably aware, camp-based models are done in many different ways, in many different places, different durations, intensities, programs. Not everywhere, it's a limited number, and they all vary. Some of those, like the ones in New York, for example, we know, I think they take patients from all over North America, if not more broadly. So there are a number of camp-based intensive rehab models for children with hemiparesis at other centers, but ours, the ones I've shown you, were limited to trials. We have translated that into, there is now a summer camp here for children with hemiparesis that's become implemented more into the clinical rehab program. It's not a research trial anymore, but that still is just limited to local participants.
Thanks.
That answers the question.
Laura, are you able to come on camera and ask your question? I'll ask it. So Laura had asked, will you address the time to intervention when individuals do not receive intensive intervention at an early age? Is there an improvement in function at age 17 and beyond?
Yeah, great question. The only thing I'd say for sure is we still don't really know when it comes to, these types of injuries in children. Obviously in our trials, which were perinatal strokes, we're well into let's call it the chronic time frame. These are children with permanent disabilities that they've had for, I didn't say it, I think, but the youngest kids in our trials are 6. So they've all had perinatal stroke. So they've all been growing up with their stroke for at least 6 years, some are 17. So when I say early intervention in that population, we're thinking about, in our trials, it was 6, and Alicia could comment, she's doing great work in the preschool aged kids, where other types of early intervention are increasingly advocated for. So it's a chronic injury, but when we're thinking about the developmental time scale, I think there's pretty good animal and some human evidence that earlier is better. That those developmental curves I showed, I think, make good sense. If your question was about time after injury, that's an even tougher question for kids who've had injuries later in childhood. We have a kid on the ward. I had this conversation with parents yesterday about when do we start rehab, and they're recovering from an acute stroke. Even I haven't looked at the literature lately, even in the adult stroke world where that's, a booming business, there's still some controversy about, what is the right time to start intensive rehab. So I think in kids, we still don't have good answers to that question.
Thanks. Randy, who I don't see on here anymore, but let's capture it for the recording, is looking for anyone doing this work in Chicago. So if any of you want to chime in, any of the neurologists on here, and then Patty wants to talk.
I'm here. Thank you.
Oh, you are. Sorry, I missed you. Does anyone know of active research or camps or anything in the Chicago area?
Adam, if you don't have anything from your teams and multi-center, there is constraint-induced movement therapy camp and then combined bimanual camps that I am aware of in the Chicago area. They're run privately, associated or not with the hospital university programs. And I think we can try to get you that information more accurately. And if anybody in the call or when someone listens to the recording knows about it, please reach out to Mara, and Mara can circulate the information to the community and the families as well. And Brian, if you're still, Dr. Wisher is our physiatrist here. If you're still in the call, I don't know if you have, he might have had to hop off. Yeah.
He's still on. He's not
Oh,
on.
he's still on. Okay. I don't have the whole pile. Sorry. I don't know if Brian Wishart knows of any other activities and active engagements going on in the Chicago area.
I can just add that, yeah, what you said, Patty, fits with my understanding. We do have some collaborations there. And Shirley Ryan there, the Shirley Ryan Center is interested in being an early adopter for the BCI program that I showed you. And so those are the main people that we would know in Chicago who are, I think, are excellent and would be that's who I would reach out to.
And my question, Adam, for you, first of all, thank you so much for not just the presentation, but the work that you've been doing for decades. I love the part where you said, I learned that neuro exam is not important. That what's important is participation and activities that the kids want to be doing. I've been learning that in my own way, coming from the acute care side. And this is what gave origin to this community and educational series and working with families. We do have several patients that will qualify for BCI. And as you know, we have Lee Hogbert and the team that kind of put the first developments, as you show in your presentation. What would it entitle? I saw yours is non-invasive, or the majority of what you presented is non-invasive. What would entitle to have, we currently have at least 3 or 4 kids that will be excellent, locked in, literally punting hemorrhage. That will be excellent candidates. They can do vertical eye movement, and they're very communicative that way, but it will be phenomenal to be able to enable more function. So do you have international participation for your studies? And if not, do you have, or can you think about, because Lee is getting involved and if he is asking for guidance, so would you lend us?
Thanks. Yes. So I have a few comments. So Lee's been a great advocate for extending into pediatrics. For those who don't know, I showed one of his papers. He's one of the pioneers in implantable BCI, and he and the BrainGate group they used to invite me to meetings, but I would tell them how complicated cerebral palsy is compared to patients with ALS or brainstem strokes in adults. And I think it scared them too much. It's too complicated. And so I don't get invited anymore. I'm just kidding kind of, but he and other leaders in the BCI world they very much are advocates for us growing into pediatric onset conditions and helping children. It's going to take time because of just some of the many complexities that I touched on. Kind of more to your question. First that I skipped over the slide of, I also do neurocritical care. And so we have actually used BCI even in the ICU in children who are acutely locked in. We've done that 4 times now, quite successfully, just to do really simple things. But kids who are acutely trapped is just terrifying. To be able to scale, I only touched on it briefly because I went over time, but we are trying to build beyond our national. We've started a Canadian network and we're just about to try to go from 3 centers to 6. We've had collaborators. I shouldn't say this. One of our systems is in Boston right now.
Okay.
And so it's possible. In fact, I think it's still there and I think they might not be using it right now. So maybe I should connect
That's what
you.
I was going to ask you also. If you have the commercial side, anything that is coming available that.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to say is that from a pure clinical research program, it's as people here would know, it's very hard to start sharing and scaling because all you've got is what you could afford with your own research grants. And so you can't start making units. These units, the package, the way we do it, I only showed you a few examples, but it's actually not even that expensive. Like we can build one of these for $4,000 or $5,000. But you can't do that on a research budget. And so you have to be able to commercialize and scale to start building them and spreading them out. So I'll give you the link to, I'll put it in the chat actually for anyone else who's interested. Our startup company has an early adopter program that allows people to sign up, get a newsletter, and as we start to scale, we've now had about, I think, 15 or 20 early adopters, families now spreading out beyond just our site, a few in the US, although we were having some trouble getting things to the US. But this is the way we're hoping to grow it. So the more places that sign up and say, hey, I'm interested, can I be an early adopter? We're still trying to figure out how to do that, but I think it's the only way that it's going to happen.
And I'm having, let's say we have the devices available. What is the training of a team to be able to operationalize and make the use of that device?
Yeah.
How long does it entitle? How do you have a sense? We do have people that specialize in communication for kids with limited communication. So we have very good teams on other kind of devices, but for this particular, what has been your experience in terms of the learning curve?
Yeah, it's early. At one end, ultimately, we're trying to empower families. And so we have seen families who are themselves, technically savvy and just want to do it, and they're familiar with other technologies. We've had some, and even you met Claire's family in the video, they do all that at home with very little technical support. That took a lot of practice. Versus, as you point out, an early way to get uptake is if you have a team who are very savvy, they know how to work with children with severe disabilities, set goals, they're comfortable with technology. We're not trying to do all of one or all of the other. But if you're at a center like yours that has that sort of team, it could be a very good starting point, because maybe you could reach many families and have a core team of experienced people help them learn how to do it. So we're trying to promote both of those models.
Excellent.
Jordan, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Jordan. I have a 10-year-old with right hemiplegia. Dr. Mussolino and Dr. Wishart care for him, so we're grateful. And thank you so much, Dr. Kirton and Payton. So impactful to hear of your own lived experience. My question is, it sounds like we have to move to Calgary to participate in all these great things that you talked about. Did I misunderstand that? Or maybe it doesn't have to be that extreme. And if you were us, would you be looking at like the brain stimulation tickling or the BCI or both? Like what would you prioritize? And I also have questions about like whether it applies to like subcortical injuries, and I'm really talking beyond my depth because I've only had AP biology and I didn't even do that well. But like my son's, I think it's more involved in the basal ganglia, thalamus. And then my last question is, he's also on ADHD stimulant medication. So what does that do about the seizure threshold?
Right. Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Going backwards, the stimulant medications wouldn't have any significant effect or concern. Which types of strokes, the details of where is the stroke, what type is it, we're not there yet. We don't have enough experience to be predictive of this will help this type, but not that type. The sport trial I mentioned is about to go into a bunch of sort of predictor analysis, we call it, that might give us some hints there. But the bigger picture question you asked, you're right. Like for the trials I showed you, as I mentioned, we can only recruit locally. I can reassure you a little bit that currently, the only sort of related trial for a 10-year-old, like we're just starting the pilot trial of the BCI with FES. That's just a pilot trial with probably be a dozen kids from Calgary just to see if it all works before we ever get to another trial. We aren't currently recruiting beyond that. Even if you lived in Calgary, is my point, that we wouldn't have a great trial to offer you today. And for the other, it kind of goes back to the last question that whether it's that or BCI or other technology, the scale is going to require time and not only multi-center trials, but spread and distribution to interested partners at other centers. And that it's a gradual process, and it takes a lot of time. But all that to say, if you caught my conclusion of our big trial was, and what I get a lot of emails about this, but I always finish the email by saying, and parents on the call can tell me how they would feel about it, but I always say, like, as of today and as whatever I can see for tomorrow, like the next year or two, you are not missing an opportunity. This is not a proven treatment that is going to help your child that you're now not able to access, which I think is a terrible feeling for most parents. I think most parents I've worked with, they just want to know they're not missing something good. We're not there yet. We haven't shown that we have something good. It's interesting. We think it's worth pursuing. But you're not missing an opportunity. And if we ever come up with an opportunity, we hope to be ready to scale it quickly so that once it's proven, it should become broadly available in short order. It's easier to say than to do, but that would be the goal. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna pass it off to Patty, and then we'll wrap up. But I will follow up with email and a survey about today's session, and with links to our past sessions and upcoming sessions. So, Patty, do you want to follow up or
I
conclude?
have a very last question, and then we can let you go. We are on the hour, and we're very thankful for your time, Adam. TMS. We have very large TMS therapeutic clinical capabilities for the adults in our combined systems where we have pediatric hospitals and adults, and there is people with enough expertise on the rehab. When do you see that? Where do you see the projection of the timeline of TMS becoming a potential therapeutic early on in the post-stroke subacute period, and in the protocols to have people that have clinical units be able to like adopt them? How are you seeing the projection of those studies? And
yeah, it'll sound like I'm copping out on the answer in the sense that we still need a lot more evidence is the short answer. So
okay.
I just saw a recent small trial of RTMS again in this population that's coming out that it's interesting. The evidence base is building. People here might be aware that RTMS is now a standard of care for major depression in adults. Yep. That goes back 25 years to Boston, actually, and other places. Yep. And it took several decades, and that's for a huge problem in adults that has very few good treatments. So for us to get there in a less common condition, very unique and probably more complicated. Well, let's say it's more complicated, but I hate to say it's going to take another 20 years, but based on history, is that reasonable? It might be, and that's even if we can show that it works. So a lot more. What we really need are more people doing well designed clinical trials. That creates opportunities for families, right? The more places doing trials, the more kids can. Doesn't mean it's going to work, but it means you can try. It means you can have access to something that might help. And so that's what we need to scale before we can think about implementation and how does it get in the clinic, and there's a lot of steps. And you're right, places like yours that have expertise in all of these fields and brainstem and stroke and cerebral palsy and rehab are the places that will make that happen. So the more of that we get, the faster things will progress.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this incredible sharing, Payton, for the story, for putting it in real life, and then Dr. Kirton for just walking us through what really takes to try to understand development, brain injury in development, and then see how can we intervene to not just improve a neurological exam, but the life of these families and kids. It's incredibly inspiring. So grateful you guys have been leading this field. We take everything we can from your groups, OT, PT, speech. You also been communicating the way to work today with families, with kids, with the needs to navigate life, to improve quality of life beyond the technologies. And I think if anybody is not familiar, go to their website. There are immense amount of resources, and we'll share them also on the handouts after the call. Thank you so much. Mara, I don't know if you want to say anything final, or we have any advertisements for
Stuart, do you want to mention your research?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think Dr. Kirton had alluded to that in some other processes we're trying to catch up in some of that work that they've been doing over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And people had asked about childhood onset stroke, whereas the brain stimulation technology, if for kids that had a stroke in childhood or adolescence. We're working on a very early phase trial. It would be called a phase 1 trial in brain stimulation for children that had a stroke in childhood or adolescence right now, that will be going on probably for the next year or two. So if anyone's interested in learning about that rehabilitation opportunity, there's a link in the chat, and I'm happy to tell you more. But just like you said, this is stuff we are trying. It's going to be a long time until we find out what works and how it works.
Thanks
Great.
for adding that, Stuart. I was this close to saying just go ask Stuart, but I didn't want to I didn't want to put you on the spot. So
Thanks. Yeah, of course. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks. And just as a reminder, our next session's on February 14th, and it's about driving, learning to drive, considerations about whether you're a good candidate for driving. You, your child, whoever has had stroke or brain injury is going to be safe and physically able to drive, visually able to drive. So that's our next topic, and we'll look forward to sharing. All right, thanks again. I'm going to close the meeting now.
Thank
thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.